First of all, Mr. President, I rise in total support of Mr. Leon.
Senate is in quorum call.
Quorum call. Dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise in total support of Mr. Leon Panetta as the new Secretary of Defense. He's an outstanding public servant who served in many capacities, and he's been a tremendous leader in every role that he's held. With that being said, I rise to speak on our war in Afghanistan. Very soon our nation, this esteemed body, and particularly the President of the United States, will address two of the greatest challenges our nation currently faces. The first is Afghanistan. The second issue is raising the debt ceiling and confronting our nation's unsustainable spending and debt. To the average American, Afghanistan and raising our debt ceiling may seem unrelated, but they are in fact directly related. They are directly related to the hard fiscal and strategic choices our nation must make if we are to remain safe and secure in the coming decades. With respect to the raising the debt ceiling, the budget realities we face are both striking and frightening. Mr. President, while some may choose to ignore this threat, mere words cannot give weight to the fiscal peril our nation now faces. Only numbers can. Since 1992, we have raised the debt ceiling 16 times. In 1992, our national debt stood at $4.1 trillion. Between 2002 and today, our national debt rose from $5.9 trillion to over $14.3 trillion. Now, for the first time in our nation's history, our yearly budget deficits may exceed $1 trillion for 4 years in a row. At the current pace of deficit spending, CRS projects our national debt will exceed $23.1 trillion by 2021. In order to pay for the financial hole we have dug, the Congressional Budget Office projects that net interest payments will increase fourfold over the next 10 years, from $197 billion in fiscal year 2011 to $792 billion in fiscal year 2021. To put that number into perspective, 1 decade from today, interest payments on our $23.1 trillion debt will exceed the amount we currently spend on education, energy, and national defense combined. Mr. President, numbers of this size are not only unimaginable, they will prove catastrophic for our nation's future. The fiscal peril we face reminds me of the words that a former senator said on this floor in declaring why he chose in 2006 to vote against raising the debt ceiling, when our national debt stood at that time at $8.18 trillion. He said, and I quote, "The rising debt is a hidden domestic enemy, robbing our cities and states of the critical investments in infrastructure like bridges, ports, and levees, robbing our families and our children of critical investments in education and health care reform, robbing our seniors of the retirement and health security they counted on. Every dollar that we pay in interest is a dollar that is not going to investment in America's priorities." That former senator was President Barack Obama. While this perspective on these words may ring different today, I believe they accurately capture the difficult choices we face today. The choice is this: will we rebuild America's future or not? Today, with our nation facing a stagnant economy and a death spiral of debt, we can no longer have it all, or pretend that we can. We must choose what, as a nation, we can and cannot afford to do. Our risky debt will not only undermine our economic security, it also threatens our national security. As Admiral Michael Mullen said, and I quote, "I believe that our debt is the greatest threat to our national security. If we as a country do not address our fiscal imbalances in the near term, our national power will erode, and the cost to our ability to maintain and sustain influences could be great." Mr. President, we can no longer, in good conscience, cut services and programs at home, raise taxes, or, this is very, very important, lift the debt ceiling in order to fund nation building in Afghanistan. 10 years ago, when our mission in Afghanistan began, it was a just and rightful mission to seek out and destroy those responsible for the terrorist attacks on 9/11 and the deaths of thousands of innocent Americans. We overthrew the Taliban government to provide a safe haven to al-Qaeda. We have hunted down and killed Osama bin Laden, as well as most of the senior members of this terrorist group. Today in Afghanistan, in a nation of 30 million people, intelligence estimates suggest that there are only between 50 and 100 al-Qaeda terrorists harbored there. Because of the incredible work of our military men and women, the mission of destroying al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, by all accounts, has been a success. But the real truth is, after 10 years, our current mission in Afghanistan has become less about destroying al-Qaeda and more about building a country where one, frankly, has never existed. In February, I saw firsthand the significant challenges our brave troops face as they pursue this nation-building mission. During the trip, I heard from Ambassador Eikenberry and General Petraeus. I visited Helmand Province and Kandahar, and I met with local tribal leaders and President Karzai of Afghanistan. What I heard from many officials and diplomats was that progress could be just around the corner, but only if we give it more time and more money. I heard that we must stay to counter the threat of al-Qaeda, but then was told that only a handful of al-Qaeda members existed in Afghanistan. I was told that governance was improving, but that corruption was so rampant that billions, yes, billions of dollars were lost to corrupt officials who seemed more interested in improving their own lives than the lives of their people. I was told that we need a sizable force to defeat the threat posed by the Taliban, but that estimating the size of the enemy was difficult. Still, everyone acknowledges that their force is a fraction of the number of troops that we have there now. I was told that because of rampant corruption and theft, the very cost of moving our supplies was directly or indirectly funding the very enemy that we face. I was told that China, yes, Mr. President, China, could reap billions of dollars by extracting resources from Afghanistan. But guess what? They are not contributing anything to the cost of security. I was told that after years of spending billions training a new Afghanistan military and police force, that it could be years longer before they could fully defend their nation and their people. And even then, it would demand billions more in funding from us. I was also told that we were building schools, roads, and infrastructure, as well as providing billions in aids for small businesses and job creation so that Afghanistan could become more self-sufficient. But that today, 97% of the Afghan economy is based on foreign aid, and that is after 10 long years. I have been told again and again that American aid is critical to rebuilding Afghanistan, but that local projects built with American tax dollars could not be branded as American-funded projects out of fear of reprisals. I was told that the people of Afghanistan truly want us there, but was then told in a meeting with President Karzai that it was time for America to leave. The American people have been hearing all of these arguments and the sad facts for nearly a decade. Now, after 10 years, I had truly hoped progress in Afghanistan would be clear, and the Afghan people would be united, and their government and leaders would be one defined by honesty, integrity, and a shared determination to build a better state. But the real truth is impossible to ignore. After 10 years, Mr. President, we face the choice of whether we will continue to spend tens of billions of tax dollars and lose precious American lives, not on fighting and killing al-Qaeda, terrorists in Afghanistan, but by policing and building a state where the leaders seem indifferent to the difficulties of their people, and their people seem indifferent at best, if not hostile, to our presence. Mr. President, tomorrow, President Obama will present to the American people his latest review on the war in Afghanistan and whether our mission will change. As it's already clear, some in this esteemed body will argue for the President to stay the course, and others will suggest a very different course. The question the President faces, and we all face, is quite simple. Will we choose to rebuild America or Afghanistan? In light of our nation's fiscal perils, we cannot do both, Mr. President. I believe that if we are being honest with the American people about the depth of fiscal challenges we face at home, it is impossible to defend the mission in Afghanistan, in which we are rebuilding schools, training police, teaching people to read, in other words, building a country, even at the expense of our own. Neither the President nor any senator can divorce the difficult decisions we must now make in Afghanistan, from the equality from the equally difficult decisions we must now make on cutting domestic spending in order to raise the debt ceiling. While the truth is the war on terrorism must be fought and it must be won, that war is not in Afghanistan. And yet, with every passing month, we are choosing to spend billions that we can't afford to fight a war against an enemy that is no longer there. Mr. President, since the day I was sworn in, I have heard from countless of my fellow West Virginians who ask, how is it possible that we are willing to spend hundreds of billions of dollars in Afghanistan while we face mountains of debt and spending cuts here at home? How is it possible that we will choose to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build Afghanistan when our children, our seniors, our veterans, the poor and the middle class are being asked to bear the brunt of massive spending cuts? I have carefully thought over these questions over these many months, and after hearing from my constituents, seeing Afghanistan again with my own eyes, listening to our soldiers on the ground, hearing from dozens of diplomats, foreign policy experts, and the military leaders over these many months, as well as confronting the truth about the fiscal and economic peril our nation faces in the coming years, I believe it is time for President Obama to begin a substantial and responsible reduction in our military presence in Afghanistan. I believe it is time for us to rebuild America, not Afghanistan. It is why I strongly agree with Senator Merkley and Lee and the words of 27 of my Republican Democratic colleagues who made it clear in their letter they sent to the President last Thursday that, and I quote, we must accelerate the transfer of responsibility for Afghanistan's development to the Afghan people and their government. We should maintain our capacity to eliminate any new terrorist threats, continue to train the Afghan National Security Forces, and maintain our diplomatic and humanitarian efforts. However, these objectives do not require the presence of over 100,000 American troops engaged in intensive combat operations. Mr. President, I believe it is time for us to compel the elected leaders of Afghanistan and its people to take responsibility for the destiny of their nation so that we can ensure the destiny of ours. In that spirit, I have sent President Obama a letter calling on him to pursue significant reductions and end the scope of our current mission in Afghanistan well before 2014. I believe any further mission in Afghanistan should, as my Senate colleagues suggested in their letter, focus primarily on responding to any resurgent terrorist threat, as well as providing targeted training for the Afghan military and police. Throughout this transition period and beyond, I have asked the President to provide the American taxpayer a monthly accounting to be published online of every dollar that will be provided to Afghanistan government officials and agencies so as to ensure that no American tax dollars are lost to corruption and greed. As for those on the right or the left who believe that leaving Afghanistan sooner is responsible, I simply ask them, is 10 years not long enough? I ask them to tell the families of our brave military men and women who are on their third and fourth tour of duty, how much longer must they wait to come home? I ask them to look into the eyes of any American child and ask them to surrender our nation's future for the sake of another. I ask all of them to explain to the American people the sanity of spending $485 billion more on top of the $443 billion that we have spent to build Afghanistan over the next decade at the very same time our nation drowns in a sea of debt. Mr. President, the time has come to make the difficult decision. Charity begins at home. We can no longer afford to rebuild Afghanistan and America. We must choose, and I choose America. As I made clear when I ran for this esteemed office, I would not put my political party before country, but would do my best to do what is right for the people of my beloved state and great nation. To that end, I promise to speak out and take positions as difficult as they may be, not for the benefit of my next election, but that are best for the next generation. It is why I spoke out about the debt, to tell the American people and the people of West Virginia that I would not vote to raise the debt ceiling without a long-term permanent fix. I did this not because it was popular or easy, but because we, as elected leaders of this great nation, have a solemn obligation to rebuild our nation before all others. Our economy, our prosperity, our schools, our children, our veterans, our soldiers, our workers, our seniors, our nation's future must come first. I, for one, will not look West Virginians in the eye and tell them that in order to raise the debt ceiling, vital programs and funding for Social Security, Medicare, our schools, roads, health care, veterans, seniors, infrastructure will be slashed. But we will continue to spend billions building schools, roads, and infrastructure in Afghanistan. The time has come for us to realize the people of Afghanistan to choose their own destiny. We cannot build it for them. The time has come for us to realize that in this time of fiscal peril, our solemn obligation is to build up our own nation, and that by doing so we will make America safer and stronger for generations to come. The words of the great West Virginian statesman Robert C. Byrd ring even more true today than in October 2009 when he gave his last floor speech and about the war in Afghanistan. Our friend said this: "During a time of record deficits, some actually continue to suggest that the United States should sink hundreds of billions of borrowed dollars into Afghanistan, effectively turning our backs on our own substantial domestic needs, all the while deferring the cost and deferring the problems for future generations to address. Our national security interests lie in defeating, no, I go further, in destroying al-Qaeda. Until we take that, and only that mission seriously, we risk adding the United States to the long list of nations whose best laid plans have died on the cold, barren, rocky slopes of that far-off country called Afghanistan. May God bless the brave men and women who serve this nation and the United States of America." Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the nomination of Leon Panetta to succeed Robert Gates. But first, I feel compelled to respond to the statements by the senator from West Virginia, which characterized the isolationist, withdrawal, lack of knowledge of history attitude that seems to be on the rise of America. In case the senator from West Virginia forgot it or never knew it, we withdrew from Afghanistan one time. We withdrew from Afghanistan, and the Taliban came eventually, followed by al-Qaeda, followed by attacks on the United States of America. The senator from West Virginia has expressed his admiration for the men and women who are serving. I hope he would pay attention to the finest military leader who will now be the head of the CIA, General Petraeus, who I think's knowledge and background may exceed that of the senator from West Virginia. If we leave Afghanistan in defeat, we will repeat the lessons of history, and it is not our expenditures on Afghanistan that are the reasons why we are now experiencing the budget difficulties that we are experiencing. I'm pleased that the senator from West Virginia went to Afghanistan once. I would suggest that he consult with the people who know best that since 2009, when the surge began, we have had success on the ground in Afghanistan, and we are succeeding. There are enormous challenges ahead of us. But as Secretary Gates has said, withdrawal to Fortress America, which is basically the message of the senator from West Virginia, will inevitably lead to attacks from them on the United States of America. I view the senator from West Virginia's remarks as at least uninformed about history and strategy and the challenges we face from radical Islamic extremism, including al-Qaeda. I urge my colleagues in the Senate to vote in favor of this nomination today. Director Panetta has had an extraordinary career of public service. He served in the House of Representatives representing his California district for 8 terms. He served in the White House as President Clinton's Chief of Staff and Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Since February 2009, he's been the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, strengthening that agency and forging positive relationships in the interagency process, and with the Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committees. It's my expectation that Director Panetta will work closely with General David Petraeus, the nominee to succeed him at the CIA, and continue the cooperation and commitment that enabled the finding and elimination of Osama bin Laden. I'm certainly hopeful that as Secretary of Defense, Director Panetta will successfully lead the effort to find and eliminate Ayman al-Zawahiri, who we are told has assumed leadership of al-Qaeda and other al-Qaeda leaders. Zawahiri is a sworn enemy of the United States and our way of life, and like bin Laden, must be dealt with in similar terms. Before discussing the challenges Mr. Panetta will encounter, I want to express my thanks and admiration for the service of Secretary Gates as he nears the end of his 4.5-year tenure as Secretary of Defense. I recall that through much of 2007 and 2008, we heard about Secretary Gates' countdown wristwatch that displayed the number of days till a new administration would take over in January 2009, and he and his wife, Becky, would finally return to their peaceful lakeside home and retirement in Washington State. It's fortunate for the country that President Obama asked and Secretary Gates agreed to postpone retirement, and that he continued to serve and presumably discarded that wristwatch. Secretary Gates testified at his nomination hearing in December 5, 2006, that he agreed to leave Texas A&M University and return to government out of love for his country. And he and his family have provided one of the greatest examples I've seen of that kind of patriotism, answering the call to duty when his talents were most needed. For this and for innumerable other contributions he has made to the men and women of the armed forces, he has truly earned a place in history as one of America's greatest Secretaries of Defense. In December 2006, at a time when so many senators were clamoring for a cut-and-run strategy in Iraq, just as they are calling for a cut-and-run strategy in Afghanistan, Secretary Gates made the following statement at his nomination hearing, and I quote, "While I am open to alternative ideas about our future strategy and tactics in Iraq, I feel quite strongly about one point. Developments in Iraq over the next year or two will, I believe, shape the entire Middle East and greatly influence global geopolitics for many years to come. Of course, over the next year or two will determine whether the American and Iraqi people and the next President of the United States will face a slowly but steadily improving situation in Iraq and in the region, or will face the very real risk and possible reality of a regional conflagration. We need to work together to develop a strategy that does not leave Iraq in chaos and that protects our long-term interests in and hopes for the region." Mr. President, you could substitute the word Afghanistan for exactly what Secretary Gates then said in December 2006. And then we had the surge. There was 59 votes against the surge that would call for withdrawal in the summer of 2007. Some of us knew what was right and fought for it, and we've succeeded in Iraq. Just as we will fight to continue the surge in Afghanistan, and we will succeed in Afghanistan, and we will come home with honor. And Afghanistan will not deteriorate to a cockpit of conflict between regional countries that will then cause, again, the threat of radical Islamic extremism to threaten our very existence, certainly pose threats of attacks on the United States. Secretary Gates was, of course, correct then about Iraq. Today we must add Afghanistan and Libya to his warning about the future consequences of the decisions we make today. In the next few months, our country faces decisions related to our national security and defense that will echo for decades to come. Decisions that will determine whether we remain the world's leading global military power, able to meet our many commitments worldwide, or whether we will begin abandoning that role. One of these decisions that will have perhaps the most impact on this outcome is our response to the President's stated goal of cutting $400 billion in national security spending by 2023, on top of the $178 billion in efficiencies and top-line reductions that Secretary Gates already has imposed. Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen have sounded the alarm against misguided and excessive reductions in defense spending that cut into the muscle of our military capabilities. If we get this wrong, it will result in a dramatic drop in U.S. influence and, as Secretary Gates has said, quote, a smaller military able to go fewer places and do fewer things. Defense spending is not what is sinking this country into fiscal crisis, and if the President and Congress act on that flawed assumption, they will create a situation that is truly unaffordable, the decline of U.S. military power and influence. It's inevitable that there will be cuts to defense spending, and some reductions are no doubt necessary to improve the efficiency of the Department of Defense. But I also remember when General Edward Meyer, then Chief of Staff of the Army, who warned in 1980 that excessive defense cuts over many years had produced a hollow Army. That is not an experience that we can or should repeat in the years to come. We must learn the lessons of history. I sincerely hope that Director Panetta, upon assuming office, will not focus exclusively on how, but on whether the President's proposal should be implemented, and will apply his independent judgment in providing advice to the President on the cuts that can be made without damage to our national security. Last week, the Committee on Armed Services completed its markup for the Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year 2012. In a very tough fiscal environment, this markup represents an effort to support our warfighters and bolster the readiness of the United States military. Unfortunately, the committee chose to authorize hundreds of millions of dollars in unnecessary and unrequested pork barrel projects and rejected my efforts to stop the out-of-control cost overruns of the F-35 program. The Defense Authorization Bill is an important piece of legislation while our country continues to be engaged in 2 wars, and therefore I voted to move the bill out of committee. Nevertheless, I will continue my efforts to fight the egregious and wasteful spending during debate on the floor of the Senate, and I will urge Director Panetta, once he is confirmed, to favorably endorse the proposals I will make to properly use precious national defense dollars. In addition, especially in this budget environment, it will be important to continue to eliminate weapons programs that are overcost, behind schedule, and not providing improvements in combat power and capabilities. After 10 years of war, we must continue to eliminate every dollar of wasteful spending that siphons resources away from our most vital need, enabling our troops to succeed in combat. One of the key criteria that I'm looking for in the next Secretary of Defense is continuity, the continuation of the wise judgment, policies, and decision-making that have characterized Secretary Gates' leadership of the Department of Defense. As Director of the CIA, Mr. Panetta has demonstrated that he possesses the experience and ability to ensure that we achieve our objectives in the 3 conflicts in which U.S. forces are now engaged: Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. In Iraq, the key question now is whether some presence of U.S. forces will remain beyond the end of this year, pending an Iraqi request and approval to support Iraq's continuing needs and our enduring national interests. I believe such a presence is necessary, and I encourage the administration to work closely with the Maliki government to bring about this outcome. In Afghanistan, the main question is the size and scope of the drawdown of forces beginning this July. Here, too, I would agree with Secretary Gates that any drawdown should be modest so as to maximize our ability to lock in the hard-won gains of our troops for the next fighting season. I hope Director Panetta, as the Secretary of Defense, will support modest reductions and take no action that would undermine the hard-won gains in Afghanistan. Finally, we know that there is growing opposition to continuing the U.S. involvement in Libya. There's already been one legislative attempt to bind the President's authority as Commander-in-Chief, and there will likely be others. In short, the accumulated consequences of the administration's delay, confusion, and lack of meaningful consultation have been a wholesale revolt in Congress against the administration's policy. Although I have disagreed and disagreed strongly at times with aspects of the administration's policy in Libya, I believe the President did the right thing by intervening to stop a humanitarian disaster in Libya. Amid all of our present arguments about legal and constitutional interpretations, we cannot forget the main point. In the midst of the most groundbreaking geopolitical event in at least 2 decades, as peaceful protests for democracy were sweeping the Middle East, with Gaddafi's forces ready to strike at Benghazi and with Arabs and Muslims in Libya and across the region pleading for the U.S. military to stop the bloodshed, the United States and our allies took action and prevented the massacre that Gaddafi had promised to commit in a city of 700,000 people. By doing so, we began creating conditions that are increasing the pressure on Gaddafi to give up power. Director Panetta has been nominated to lead our armed forces amid their 10th year of strange overseas combat. Not surprisingly, this has placed a major strain on our forces and their families, and yet our military is performing better today than at any time in our history. That is thanks to the thousands of brave young Americans in uniform who are writing a new chapter in the history of our great country. They have shown themselves to be the equals of the greatest generations before them. And the calling that all of us must answer in our service is to be equal and forever faithful to the sacrifice of these amazing Americans. I have outlined some of the challenges that lay before Director Panetta. I have the highest confidence, however, that he is their equal. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from West Virginia.
Ask consent to respond.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Sir, I have the utmost, the quorum call be officiated.
Without objection. Senator from West Virginia.
I have the utmost respect from the senator from Arizona, his commitment to this great country, his service to this great country. I can only report what I have seen. I've been there twice. I was there as the governor in 2006 in Afghanistan, representing the great National Guard of West Virginia. I went back as 2010. I did not see an improvement. I saw deterioration. I did not see a country that had an infrastructure and economy. I saw a corrupt leadership, and I saw nothing good coming of it. With that, I know that the senator has had much more experience in that. I can only speak from a sense of common sense and speaking to the people of West Virginia and what they feel. We are a very hockey state, as you know, and we're a very patriotic state. But if 10 years is not enough, how long is enough? And I think that's the question being asked, that the sacrifices are being asked by them. And when we can't build the water lines and sewer lines in West Virginia that are needed, fix the roads and repair the bridges, but yet they hear the billions that we're spending in a country that really doesn't want us there, I think it's time to leave. And respectfully, sir, that might be the disagreement we have. Thank you.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
We are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be terminated.
Without objection.
Thank you. I rise today in support of the nomination of Leon Panetta for Secretary of Defense. To the President, you have chosen wisely. You have a terrific national security team in place. General Petraeus to become the CIA Director. Mr. Donlan's done a great job as National Security Advisor. Leon Panetta could not have chosen better. So I'm just very pleased with Ambassador Crocker. Ambassador Eikenberry and General Petraeus did a heck of a job over in Afghanistan, but Ambassador Crocker is going to be the best we have to offer on that side of the military-civilian partnership in Afghanistan. But Leon Panetta heading up the Department of Defense is just a home run choice. I've known Leon for quite a while, and I just want to let the country know that I think the President made a very wise decision. Now, tomorrow night, he's supposed to tell us about Afghanistan. From my point of view, for what it's worth.
My colleague yield for just
Yes,
one
please.
second? Before he goes on to Afghanistan,
Yes.
if the gentleman would yield, I just wanted to add my accolades to Leon Panetta. I know him well. We actually roomed together for 11 years here in Washington. He is a strong man. He is a smart man. He is an honorable man. He's a devout man. And he will be a great Secretary of Defense. So I wanted to thank my colleague for praising him and add my accolades, and I thank the gentleman for his time.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And that shows you that's about as bipartisan as it's going to get, Lindsey Graham and Chuck Schumer. That shows you the depth and breadth of Leon's Panetta's the way people view him up here. Now, one of the first decisions he'll have to make is what to tell the President about Afghanistan. I know we're war-weary. We've been there 10 years. The reason we went there to begin with is we just didn't throw a dart at the map. The reason America went to Afghanistan is that's the place the Taliban were controlling, invited al-Qaeda to come in to be the honored guest. Bin Laden had a welcomed home in Afghanistan. The rest is history. So President Bush understood the Taliban were a force for evil. They allowed Bin Laden to come to Afghanistan and plan the attacks of 9/11. He gave them choices. They chose poorly. We went in, take the Taliban down. We have a war in Iraq. We can debate whether we should win in Iraq or not. But the truth of the matter is, one of the reasons that we're still sort of in the infant stage, not the infant stage, but we're not where we'd like to be 10 years later, is that a lot of the resources that we had in Afghanistan went to Iraq. But now we finally got it right. For the last 17 months, we've had enough troops in Afghanistan to make a difference. And to President Obama, I know that was a very hard decision for you to make, to add 30,000 additional troops at a time when most people said, why are we still there? Can't we come home? The President chose wisely. 2014 is the transition goal, to transition to Afghan control. I think we're well on track. So tomorrow night, the President's going to tell us about withdrawing troops. I believe we can. Not because we're tired, but because success on the ground. And let me point out some successes that, in my view, would allow the President to make a reasoned judgment to withdraw troops. But the one thing I would urge the President to do is never lose sight of the fact of why we win and what our national security goals are in Afghanistan. He'll be judged, all of us will be judged, not by the day we left, but by what we left behind. And what do we want to leave behind? The ability of the Afghan people to say no to the Taliban and reject extremism. They have the will, they just don't have the capacity yet, but they're getting there. So anytime you have a desire of people who've been oppressed by groups like the Taliban and al-Qaeda, and you can help them help themselves, it makes us all safer. Now, here's what's happened since the President sent surge forces in. In November of 2009, there were 2 nations and 30 NATO trainers. 2 nations helping train the Afghan security forces from NATO, and they had a combined 30 people. You could put them all in a bus. Well, one thing that the President did is when he surged American forces, he insisted that NATO step up their game. And here we are today. We have 1,300 NATO trainers in Afghanistan with 32 countries providing assistance. We have 49 different countries helping in some form of training. In the last 17 months, we've added 90,000 Afghan Army and police forces. So there's been a surge far beyond the American coalition surge of Afghan forces. How did that happen? We have better training. In September of 2009, 800 people were joining the Afghan Army per month. They were losing 2,000 a month. That was a terrible trend. In December 2009, because of this new construct we came up with, we've been averaging 6,000 Army recruits a month, 3,000 for the police. Today we have 160,000 in the Afghan National Army, 126,000 in the Afghan National Police. By the end of the year, we'll have 305,000 Army and police under arms in Afghanistan. And the reason that's happened is because we've changed the way we train the Afghan security forces. So I hope that the President, listening to Leon Panetta, Secretary Gates, and Secretary Petraeus, will tell the American people we can start bringing forces home beginning this summer because we've been successful, and we're not going to do anything to undermine that success because it's come at such a heavy price. In reality, ladies and gentlemen, we've been in Afghanistan with the right configuration for about 18 months. The Army retention rates today in the Afghan Army are 69%, almost doubled. The literacy rate among the Afghan Army and police forces is twice that of the national population because we focused on literacy. It's hard to be a policeman or an Army officer if you can't read or write. We're helping a people that have been dirt poor, that have been at war for 30 years, that have been treated so poorly by everybody in the world. And at the end of the day, it is in our national security interest to make sure the country where the Taliban took over and allowed bin Laden to come in as an honored guest never goes back in the hands of extremists. I am confident that Leon Panetta has the wisdom and background as CIA director, member of Congress, successful business person, to lead the Pentagon at the most challenging time since World War II. He's taking over from Bob Gates, and there's not enough we can say or do for Secretary Gates to thank him. He's had the job for 5 years. When he came on board, Iraq was a hopeless lost cause in the mind of many, and he and General Petraeus, Ambassador Crocker, and many others, mainly our troops and coalition forces, took Iraq that was on the verge of the abyss, and we're now on the verge of a representative government that can defend itself and be an ally of the United States. Having Saddam Hussein replaced by a representative government in Iraq aligned with us is priceless. If we could, as a nation, take the place that we were once attacked from, turn it over to people who want to go a different way than the Taliban, and they have the ability to fight back and say no, all of us will be safer. So, Mr. President, congratulations on picking Leon Panetta to be Secretary of Defense. I know you've had a lot of hard decisions in the war on terror. One of the biggest decisions you're going to make is coming up maybe tomorrow night. I want to work with you, Republicans and Democrats together, making sure that our nation is never attacked again from Afghanistan. That is possible. We're on the verge of getting that right. As we draw down troops, please, Mr. President, tell those who are left behind in Afghanistan still fighting that you haven't lost sight of the prize. The prize is not just bringing our troops home. The prize is to make sure that their children never have to go back and fight in the future. That's the goal, is to withdraw from Afghanistan in a way that we're safer, our national security is enhanced, and we're on the verge of achieving that goal. What Secretary Panetta and others are going to be challenged with as we go forward in the 21st century is going to be substantial. The enemy is still alive, even though not well. We have punished the enemy, al-Qaeda and other extremist groups, but they will not give up easily. And the goal at the end of the day for our country to be safe is to do more than kill bin Laden. Killing bin Laden was a form of justice long overdue, and it did make us safer. But the ultimate security in this world lies not with our ability to kill individuals, but with our ability to help those who could fight in their own backyard, protect themselves from terrorism. That really is security that's sustainable. If we can leave Afghanistan in 2014 in a fashion that they have the capacity to marry up with their will to say no to the Taliban and turn their country around toward the light, not the darkness, then I can say without any doubt that our country did the right thing. If we cut this operation short because we're tired and weary, we will pay a price. At the end of the day, our values are so much better than the enemies we will win. They have patience and bad ideas. We have a lot of good ideas for the future of mankind. The question is, do we have the patience to make sure those ideas can flourish? This is a long, hard war fought by a few. We're on the verge of success. I could not think of a better person to lead us to complete success, enduring success, than Leon Panetta. So I look forward in a bipartisan fashion to voting for, I think, one of the best choices the President could have made as Secretary of Defense. And to Bob Gates, whatever you do in retirement, wherever you go, you have you have my respect, admiration, and on behalf of the American people, you will go down in history as one of the steadiest hands America could have ever had during challenging times. With that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, first let me thank the Senator from South Carolina for his analysis in Afghanistan, as well as his great support for Leon Panetta and his comments about Bob Gates, which I very much share, and indeed commented earlier this afternoon in a very similar way. I particularly want to commend Senator Graham for his analysis of what's changed in Afghanistan in the last 17 or 18 months, so that the reductions which will be announced tomorrow are not based on getting tired, but are being based, I'm sure, on the conditions on the ground or in Afghanistan, and on the critical changes which have taken place in Afghanistan. And I very much agree with his assessment about the surge in the Afghan forces. I was listening to his comments from a monitor, and when I heard his analysis about 90,000 additional Afghan forces, he's exactly right. The surge has not just been 30,000 on our troops, but they've been 3 times that much in terms of Afghan troops. And the importance of that is not just the numbers, not just the training,
right,
and not just the literacy, which the Senator pointed out, but also the mentoring and the partnering in the field with coalition forces. And we've tracked this very, very carefully, and there's been a significant increase in the number of Afghan units that consistently are in the field partnering with our troops and with other coalition members' troops. And that makes a huge difference, too, because when the Afghan people see Afghan troops in the lead instead of foreign nations' troops in the lead, they understand that, in fact, the Taliban and their argument that they're being occupied is a false propaganda argument, and that weakens the Taliban tremendously as well. So I just
Well,
want
would
to
the
commend-
gentleman yield, because this is a time to have some good, healthy bipartisanship. Senator Levin, is it not true? I have to ask you a question. You have been saying, as long as I can remember, that the surge that really needs to occur is on the Afghan side. And you focused like a laser for the last couple of years on training capacity. Not only are we producing 90,000 additional Afghan Army and police forces, 97% of them now can pass Western shooting standards. 2 years ago, less than a third. Of the NCOs, non-commissioned officers graduating from the schools in Afghanistan, about 80% literacy rates. 2 years ago, it was less than 50%. So what I want to acknowledge is that Senator Levin has been focusing on what I think is the ticket home with honor and security, building up an Afghan Army and police force that can fight the fight without 100,000 Americans. We're well on the way, and if we had not changed our training program, which you've been focused on for a very long time, we would not have this success. So General Caldwell, I think, is one of the unsung heroes of this war, but I couldn't agree more with my colleague from Michigan. The reason we can bring American troops home is because there's more Afghans to do the fighting. And you mentioned during the surge in Helmand, it was a 10-to-1 ratio. For every Afghan, there were 10 American forces. It's almost 50-50 today, with a climb to where it will be Afghans in the lead. And the final thought is among the trainers themselves. The goal by 2013 is to replace NATO trainers with Afghan trainers. And we're well on our way to having a majority of the training done by Afghans themselves. So if we can get the fighting ratios to 1-to-1 this year and improve on that by 2014, we will be able to turn the country over to the Afghan security forces. And I think we've got a good plan. Let's just stick with it.
Yeah, I want to first of all, thank my good friend from South Carolina for those comments, and he's been very, very perceptive of the importance of turning over this responsibility to the Afghans as soon as possible. We are clearly on that track to do exactly that, and it is that improvement in the situation on the ground that will allow, hopefully, for a significant reduction that will be announced tomorrow. That's our hope, my hope. But the senator from South Carolina has, I think, seen this right from the beginning, that we wanted success, and we could have success in Afghanistan, and indeed we see some real evidence of that success in the military situation on the ground. If only that could be equivalent to the governance situation, we all would be a lot more comfortable.
One final thought. The two big impediments to our success in Afghanistan are Pakistan and poor governance. The reason the Taliban came back is because the governance in Afghanistan was poor, not well accepted by the people, and lack of security. We now have better security, and I do see signs of better governance, and we got to fix the Pakistan side of the equation. But on the Afghan side of the border, we're doing about everything I know we can do to build up the Afghan people. We will deal with Pakistan, we will deal with better governance, but none of that's possible without better security. Now we have a security environment that I think will lead to better governance, but don't lose sight of the prize, and that is to leave the country in a sustainable manner. So I look forward to working with Senator Levin to push the Afghan government to do their part, and also to engage Pakistan and say, what you're doing in Pakistan is unacceptable. Stop the double dealing. Get involved. Thank you.
I know our presiding officer, Senator Shaheen, is very much into the issue of putting some real pressure on Pakistan to end the Haqqani network's intrusions and excursions into Afghanistan. And I think we're all together on that essential goal of changing Pakistan behavior in terms of what they are allowing to occur on their soil, which is that safe haven, particularly for the Haqqanis. Again, I want to thank my friend from South Carolina. I'm reminded by something he said of an early visit that I paid to Afghanistan, by the way, when with a number of colleagues who were with me, and I think Senator Reid and one other senator were with me, and we were with a bunch of Afghan leaders in a small town. This is what they call their shura. And it just happened they were having this the day we were visiting. And there were maybe 50 or 60, 70 guys, old guys, all guys, sitting on the ground on a dirt floor. And we intruded and barged in, and I asked one question. I said, do you want us here? And the answer was, we want you to train our Army and leave. And then we will invite you back as guests. You can't say it much more succinctly, I think. And I yield the floor. Note the absence of...
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
The Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent that further